Right now we're being joined by Mary Hall-Ries. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Now, your family is originally from Cuba, correct? Your dad came in early 50s?
My dad was a physician, and he made the choice to come to the United States in 1951 and subsequently married my mother in 53 and settled in San Antonio, where I was born.
So at the time of the crisis, you had been born?
Oh, yes. I was 6 years old.
6 years old. So you were an elementary student yourself?
I remember I was in a Catholic girls' school, and I remember all of the little girls in my class in our little skirts ducking under the desk, which was ridiculous. And I was an only child, and my father was a scientist, so, he clearly said, and I probably wasn't very popular in school because he told me getting under a desk is not going to help you if you're in the middle of a nuclear attack. And of course, I felt compelled to share that with everyone in my class.
So Mary's just terrifying everybody. It won't work.
Yeah.
It won't work.
Yeah, I was a know-it-all from day one.
Were the nuns happy with you about that?
No,
I figured not.
Yeah.
Now, at the time, obviously, Cuba's going through significant change in the 1950s. The revolution happens in 1959. And as we begin to talk about Cuba at the time, we want to bring up a couple of images. The first is going to be of Fidel Castro himself, and then we've also got a picture of Fidel Castro with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at this period of time. So we'll go to the Castro picture, image 5, and then we'll go to the Khrushchev image, and talk a little bit about what was happening in Cuba at the time. Castro had taken over the revolution. It had been a country that was, very economically independent and flourished in a lot of ways, and now we were communists, and things changed radically.
Very radically. My father's family had a sugar plantation in Cuba, and it was something that had, their land had been in their family for many generations. And his father was also a physician in Havana. So everything that people owned was lost immediately as all land ownership transferred to the state. And personal possessions were also given up to the state. The majority of my family left Cuba at that time. We have a lot of family stories of incidents that occurred. My father's older sister, Angelita, who was quite the grande dame, and was not going to leave her jewelry behind. And she had long platinum blonde hair, which she pulled up on the top of her head and hid about $1 million worth of diamonds inside of her hair. Now, had they stopped her when she was getting onto the airplane, and they did make her take everything out of her handbag and turn other things over, they had little boxes where you would just dump the contents of your purse out. They wouldn't let you leave with those things. But they didn't make her take her hair down, so I don't know what would have happened. She might have been shot or something, but it was important enough for her to take that risk, and so she did.
Well, so the big beehive was very
beehive.
helpful. And of course, today we'd be looking at that hair and thinking how weird, because no one wears a beehive. But the beehive hairstyle of the late 50s and early 60s was a popular hairstyle to have. So, Interesting.
Yeah, she was a character.
Let's see what questions our student groups have. Let's go to Pennsylvania first. Westmont Hilltop, a question from you guys.
Can you describe what it was like to practice air raid drills in school? Was there ever a fear that it's not a drill?
Oh, very cool. She's asking about air raid drills. What was it like to practice the drills? Was it ever a fear that it wasn't a drill, that it might be real? Do you remember that?
I guess in the back of your mind, you thought maybe it might be real, but, again, I was in a Catholic girls' school, and I was 6 years old, so we just thought it was pretty funny. And, you're in first grade. You don't really take anything terribly seriously. The most shocking memory that I have was actually not of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but when Kennedy was shot, and that suddenly things were very serious then. But maybe because my dad had told me that you can duck and cover all you want, but it's not going to help you if this is for real. What was going through my head was, okay, fine, you want me to get under the desk, I'll get under the desk, but here we all are.
Exactly. Great question. Thanks so much. Let's go back to Slater, Missouri. Slater, another question from you.
Who do you feel was most responsible for the crisis?
Well, that's an interesting perspective. We can ask that of all of our guests, but do you think this was Soviets, Cuban-American, the way it was all dealt with. How would you reply to that?
That is a really interesting question. Having grown up in the Cuban community, I think there were a lot of people at fault, and maybe it was just the way that culturally countries dealt with one another at that time. But certainly everyone in the Cuban community that was in the United States blamed Castro, because they blamed Castro for all of the problems that they had naturally. You know, he had changed their life in a very, very negative way. And from their perspective, he was insane, and he had made promises that already it was becoming very clear that what he had promised and the reality of it did not match. And in spite of the fact that the Soviets actually had a clearer head in the situation, the biggest concern that everyone had is, this guy's nuts. You know, he's a troublemaker, basically. So if something's going to go wrong here, he will instigate that. And so within, you know, the cultural consciousness of the Cuban community, that was the biggest concern, I would say.
And historically, it's probably important for people to realize that at this point in time, Castro has experienced the Bay of Pigs invasion. He's experienced the fact that America has stated, you know, we've got the embargo going, we don't like him. He was significantly worried about an invasion from the United States. And obviously he was trying to flex his muscles a little bit, for sure. Ron, you wanted to add something in?
Yeah, I have another slightly different take on it. I think a lot of the blame has to be put on Khrushchev. If you look at the result of the whole thing, they actually got the missiles removed from Turkey. Which was a big plus. I mean, to get rid of those missiles in Turkey, and it was kind of a venture for him to go out and try to do something that would stop the world and pay it and cause attention to be shifted to Russia. And the downside was, if everything goes wrong, we'll settle for take our missiles out, and they'll take theirs out of Turkey. And he actually ended up with that kind of result. So I think it was calculated by Khrushchev. I really do. I think it was calculated.
Well, I think that's an interesting perspective in addition, because we've learned since then that Khrushchev was going through a power struggle within the Soviet, it's called the Politburo, which is in essence their big group of people that determines things in the Soviet Union at that period of time, and that he was going through a real power struggle. And he was trying to assert himself. And it's just a couple of years later, it's 63, if I'm remembering my history right, maybe as late as 64, but I think it's 63, Khrushchev is overthrown and Leonid Brezhnev becomes the head of the Soviet Union. So there is some theory out there that he was attempting to prove his own strength. He didn't want to do anything that would cause nuclear war, but he wanted the hardliners in the Soviet Union to see him as someone who was hardline himself. We've had a couple of email questions that have come in, and this is a perfect time, as you talk about this, Mary, to look at Cuba, about what life might have been like in Cuba. We've got some newsreel footage for you of inside Cuba at the time, and so you'll see some video of rallies in Cuba against America at this point.
Castro has put every able-bodied man through military training. He has even armed some as young as 12 years of age, and authorities assembled thousands in cities and villages for patriotic rallies. As in the past, these rallies are designed to whip up hate of what Castro calls Yankee imperialistic warmongers. To suggestions that a UN team inspect missile sites, Castro said that they had better come ready for combat. He went on to call President Kennedy a pirate for setting up the quarantine.
There you get some images of Castro in action, whipping up the people. And in essence, unlike the United States, the media flow, everything in Cuba would have been through Castro and his administration. So they knew just what, in essence, he was telling them.
Everything was controlled through the state. And just from a personal perspective, from my own family, I had two half-sisters. My half-sister Lili was able to leave Cuba with her husband. They lost everything, and his family has quite a story as well. His father had worked his way up from nothing, sweeping the floors in a toy factory. He had then started managing the factory, put himself through school, bought the factory, and had several factories, and that was all through the sweat of his brow, and he had to give that up. And so my sister's father-in-law, he also left with his wife, but he wasn't able to speak for 3 years. He was in shock, from having to leave everything that he had worked so hard his entire life for. My other sister, Alicia, was married, unfortunately, to someone who had become involved in the Castro regime at a pretty high level. And my father tried sending private planes to get her and her 2 young children off the island, but he wouldn't let her leave. And she was, at the time, about 8.5 months pregnant, right in the middle of this crisis. And they took her to the hospital, and of course, everything was in turmoil, and we don't exactly know what happened. We just know that they weren't able to give her the medical care that she needed, and she died. And it was one of only 2 times that I ever saw my father cry, because I think, he felt terrible that he wasn't there. Being a physician, he believed that he could have helped her, he could have saved her, and also that he wasn't able to just personally extricate her and her children. And they never did, the children never were able to leave Cuba, so I've never met them. So many, many things were happening at that time. But to say that all of the populace that was still on the island were behind Castro is inaccurate. I would say it's far from accurate. Many of those people didn't have the means to leave when they wanted to, but they did, many of them did want to leave. But what are you going to do? It's like any other time when you have no weapons, but you're, controlled by a state that has weaponry, and they're willing to kill you for their beliefs. So are you going to march in a rally? Of course you are. And that's the truth of it.
Thanks, Mary. St. Michael, a final question from you guys for Mary, and then we're going to meet our 4th guest.
While in America, did you want your family to leave your home because of this crisis and relocate?
So while you were in America, did your family talk about other relatives and friends they had back there? Were they worried that they wouldn't be able to get out in the crisis? Did you want them to be able to get out? What do you remember about that kind of family dynamic?
Well, I think that, my father tried for years to get his grandchildren off the island, but their father was still there and wouldn't allow it, and so that wasn't possible. So yes, there was constant worry about that. There were my sister would have loved for her mother to leave, but she was older at that time, and she just didn't think that she could make a new life for herself in the United States. So yes, there were concerns, but constant communication. And I remember I remember a friend of mine who was at the ripe old age of 14, even, when we were the same age, who lived in Miami, and she was still caught up in trying to overthrow the Castro regime. It never ended. I mean, the Cuban community is a strong community. They're very tightly knit, and those who were able to get out never forgot and never tried. I don't think they've ever stopped trying to change things in Cuba.
Mary, thanks very much for being with us today. We really appreciate that
Thank you.
perspective very much.